and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 7, Antigua and Barbuda. Welcome to the Americas and the Caribbean. We've finally made it into the Western Hemisphere and begin talking about island countries. Antigua and Barbuda is, surprise surprise, made up of the islands of Antigua, where the majority of the population is, and Barbuda. There are also several other smaller islands, including the uninhabited island of Redonda. Antigua and Barbuda is located in the region of the Caribbean known as the Leeward Islands, which are located in the northeast corner of the Caribbean Sea. Some neighboring islands include the divided island of St. Martin, and the British island of Anguilla, to the west the country of St. Kitts and Nevis, and to the south the British island of Montserrat and the French island of Guadeloupe. The islands have roughly 96,000 people on them, with the majority of the population being of African descent. 91% are black, with 3% having some sort of Hispanic heritage. There's also 5% of the country being mixed, and 2% being white, mainly British, although Irish and Portuguese are also prominent on the island. Smaller ethnic groups such as Arabs, Chinese, and Indians also exist on the island. Most Antiguans speak English, although they speak a distinct form known as Leeward Creole. A Creole language is pretty much a language that is based on an already existing language, like English in this case, and is changed or altered by the mixing of different languages, again in this case a variety of West African languages. This means that while Creole speakers certainly are speaking English, it comes with its own slang, accent, and grammatical rules that can alter the language significantly. In terms of religion, most are Protestant Christians, with 68% practicing some form of Protestantism, with Anglicans, Seventh-day Adventists, and Pentecostals being the largest groups. Religious minorities including atheists or irreligious people, who make up 10% of the population, Catholics who make up 8% of the population, and smaller groups such as Mormons, Rastafarians, and Muslims are also present. Antigua and Barbuda has been settled by the indigenous peoples of the Americas for over 5,000 years. It is believed many of the first settlers originally came from South America, who traveled north along the Lesser Antilles. The Taino people would settle the islands, bringing with them agriculture and many of the crops that played an important role in the Antiguan diet, like corn, sweet potatoes, tobacco, and pineapple. The Taino people would be forced out of the islands by the Carib people during the early first millennium CE. The Caribs would be the rulers of the region by the time the Europeans arrived. Antigua and Barbuda were spotted by Christopher Columbus in 1493, where he named both islands. Interestingly enough, we know Antigua refers to a church in Spain, and we know Barbuda means bearded, but we don't know why he called it that. It is debated that this comes from either the Caribs on the island, who must have had long, awesome beards, or the fig trees on the island, with their hanging roots, or possibly the waves on the island when they crash on the shore. The sea foam kind of looks like a beard. Ultimately, we don't really know. Regardless, the Caribs on the island didn't have too long to figure out what Columbus meant. While they were mostly left alone by Europeans at first, experiencing only limited trade, they were decimated by old world diseases, killing off most of the population. European powers who had first avoided settling the region due to stiff Carib resistance can now expand and colonize the region. The English had first settled Antigua in 1632. Antigua was served two primary purposes for the British. First, as a military base to check Spanish and French power in the region. The British fortified Antigua, and the capital of St. John would be used as a base for the British Navy or privateers to raid and harass hostile ships and forts in the Caribbean. A plantation owner, Christopher Codrington, would help develop the colony during its early days and would found the town of Codrington in Barbuda. Antigua would have to deal with a French takeover of the island in 1666 and a French raid in 1712. However, the region would be distinctly under British control after the 7 Years' War in the late 18th century, with almost all neighboring islands coming under British rule. The island would gain a reputation as a horrible place to serve in the British Navy, with many dying due to disease or the tough working conditions on a British ship in the Caribbean heat. The second purpose of Antigua and Barbuda was as a plantation colony. At first, Irish indentured servants were brought over to work the plantations, but many died due to tough working conditions, and quickly many Irish refused to move to Antigua. The British then switched to bringing slaves from West Africa to work the plantations. Many would be brought to Barbuda before being moved to either Antigua or to other islands in the British West Indies. While tobacco and indigo were grown on the island, the vast majority of slaves would work on the sugarcane plantations that came to dominate the economy. A slave's life on Antigua was brutal. The long hours of work under the hot sun already made the job difficult, but the slaves on Antigua also had to deal with notoriously cruel and paranoid masters. At the start of the 18th century, the vast majority of the population was enslaved, and the whites on the island feared slave uprisings and that the blacks on the island would commit an ethnic cleansing against them. This led to white slave owners killing and torturing any slaves who they suspected, often with little or no evidence, of holding rebellious thoughts or ideas. During this period of Antigua's history, there would be several small uprisings, but nothing close to what the white elites feared. In 1701, a group of slaves in Antigua would kill their master after he refused to give them Christmas. In 1729, 4 slaves would be accused of planning to kill all whites on the island. In 1741, a rebellion in Codrington would lead to several cows and one white slave owner being killed before it was put down. However, the most famous of the slave uprisings would take place in 1736, with the slave Prince Claas being accused of plotting to kill all the whites on the island via exploding 10 tons of gunpowder in the town hall. Claas and 131 other co-conspirators were killed by being burned alive, being hung in chains and left to die, or beaten and tortured to death. However, historians today are divided if Claas actually intended to kill all the whites on the island, or even if the uprising was all just made up by paranoid slave owners, and those they killed were all innocent. Regardless, most slave resistance will be relegated to more subtle means. This often means that slaves would just break their plantation tools, feign misunderstanding directions, or fake sickness to get out of work. Some would even run away, forming small communities in the interior of Antigua, or trying to smuggle themselves off the island. Slavery would continue in the colony until 1834, when the slaves were freed by the Slavery Abolition Act. After emancipation, some blacks were able to move up the social ladder, but most were still relegated to the bottom of the social order. Many still had to work on plantations, and while working conditions were better with no more beatings, they still had to work long hours for little pay, and with no real social welfare on the island. Also, as a small side note, the island of Redonda, which had largely been uninhabited except for the occasional pirate, temporarily had a small mining community on the island, mining for guano, or fertilized bird poop, from 1816 to 1914. By 1929, the island would become uninhabited again, which remains so to this day. Although, in 1880, writer M.P. Shell did claim the island as his own kingdom. The claim that the island is the kingdom exists today, with several people claiming to be the island's king. In 1939, the Antigua Trades and Laborers Union was formed, with it fighting for workers' rights and greater political power for the black community on the island. In 1946, the union would form a political party, the Antigua and Barbuda Labor Party, or ABLP, with universal suffrage on the island being declared in 1951. The ABLB dominated the nation's politics, with it winning nearly every election, and began implementing the start of a social welfare state and began building up infrastructure on the island. The party would be dominated by Veer Bird, a 7-foot-tall black trades unionist who dominated the country's politics for most of his life. After World War II, the British, recognizing both the rising costs in having so many colonies abroad and under greater political pressure from within for self-determination, began working towards giving greater political autonomy to their colonies, including Antigua and Barbuda. In 1958, all the British Caribbean colonies, except for the British Virgin Islands and the Bahamas, were merged together into a single political unit known as the West Indies Federation. It was hoped that this federation would become its own independent country, similar to Canada or Australia. However, economic restrictions between the islands and political infighting led to it being dissolved in 1962. Independence would eventually be achieved in 1981, with Veer Bird becoming the first Prime Minister. However, the Queen of the UK would remain the Queen of Antigua and Barbuda, with the country remaining in the British Commonwealth. The Queen has little actual political power in the country, with her role mainly just assigning who the Governor-General will be. The Governor-General's job is mainly to act as the Queen's representative, who acts as a kind of ceremonial leader. Ultimately, the Prime Minister holds the most power in the country, with him being seen as the nation's leader. Bird's rule in the country was categorized by both economic growth along with corruption. The country began moving from an agricultural-based economy to a more tourism and service-based one. Barbuda in particular has become popular with its sandy beaches and cool climate being a hotspot for tourism. This brought in more money into the country and increased its presence in the Caribbean. It also continued to build infrastructure, and the average Antiguan and Barbudan's income increased. Ties to America, Venezuela, and other Caribbean states grew, and foreign money was brought into the country. However, the Bird years were notorious for being corrupt. Money was often taken out of social programs and went into political ministers' pockets. In 1990, a scandal emerged where guns intended to go to the Royal Antiguan and Barbudan's Defense Force were instead transferred to Colombian drug cartels. In 1994, Bird would step down, and his son, Lester Bird, would become Prime Minister. The ABLB's rule in the country would be brought to an end in 2004 with the electoral success of the United Progressive Party, or UPP, taking power led by Baldwin Spencer. It's important to note that both the ABLB and the UPP both occupy the same ideological niche. Both are center-left parties with strong ties to the black community and seek to appeal to the working class. People generally tend to vote based on which party's candidates they think is more competent, rather than any ideological concern. The UPP managed to take power due to the growing unpopularity of the ABLP and its growing corruption in the 90s, including Lester Bird's son, Ivor Bird, getting caught dealing cocaine. In 2014, the ABLP would return to power after winning an election in 2014. With Gaston Brown, nephew-in-law to Lester Bird, taking power. Brown still remains the Prime Minister today, with his primary goals being to grow the country's middle class and the economy. However, despite the government's efforts and the GDP rising, many in the country still struggle financially. Tourism has decreased in recent years, and especially during the coronavirus, as fewer people are traveling around the world. Also, a fun little side note, the highest point in the country, Boggy Peak, was temporarily renamed to Mount Obama in 2009 to celebrate the achievement of a black person becoming President of the United States. Sadly, we never got to see Obama on Mount Obama, as he never visited the country. With the end of Obama's second term in 2016, Mount Obama was changed back to Boggy Peak. Antigua and Barbuda also has another problem they have historically had to deal with as far back as the days of the Taino people: hurricanes. In 2017, Hurricane Irma devastated the country, utterly destroying Barbuda, with 95% of the buildings being damaged, with some estimates saying around $300 million in damages occurred, along with the ecosystem of the island taking a hit, and 3 people dying. The entire population of Barbuda had to be transferred to Antigua, while Barbuda was being rebuilt. I don't 100% know, but I think the population in Barbuda has been transferred back to the island as of writing this in June 2020. But the damages to the island is still seen and felt today. As the climate changes and sea levels rise, experts believe Antigua and Barbuda will have to deal with more powerful and dangerous storms in the future. So why does Antigua and Barbuda exist? Antigua and Barbuda are 2 islands whose close proximity have linked them with each other. Both islands will need to work together to ensure that tourism continues in the country, the economy and the income for the average person increases, and to rebuild and prepare for the next big hurricane to hit the country. Next time we will travel south to Argentina, our first Spanish-speaking and South American country, prepare for civil wars, territorial disputes, federalism, and a lot of Italians. Thank you. My email is whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for if you want to send me suggestions, thoughts, comments, or hate mail. The sources I used for this video are Antigua and Barbuda's Broadcasting Services documentary, BC Bird Father of the Nation, Antigua's newsroom video, Antigua's Residents Speak Out, BBC's article, Unearthing Antigua's Slave Past, the BBC documentary, Nelson's Caribbean Hellhole, Envision's Films video on Gaston Brown, Everyculture.com's article on Antigua and Barbuda, General Knowledge's video, The Caribbean Country No One Knows About, the West Indies Federation, Geography Now's video, Antigua and Barbuda, Mr. History's video, A Quick History of Antigua and Barbuda, Smithsonian Magazine's article, Antigua's Disputed Slave Conspiracy of 1736, and Wikipedia.